China's the only major country now that still maintains its zero COVID policy, which could have some real impacts to its economy going forward. That's exactly what we're going to be covering in this video. So smash that like button and subscribe if you're new. You're watching More Money. Let's get it. Guys, the overall vaccination rates in North America are getting up there, and many places have started loosening restrictions, even with the Omicron variant starting to make waves. In New York, despite the new variant, they have ruled out a lockdown similar to what was proposed in the early days of the pandemic. But of course, soaring infections are impacting city services, and this stance may change by the time I release this video. In China, the opposite is happening, and it's very concerning to me as an investor in Alibaba. It looks like China's early success in controlling the pandemic through an iron fist authoritarian type stance has convinced their leaders that a zero COVID policy is the correct action against the virus. Even with the entry of the highly infectious but seemingly less deadly Omicron variant, many officials now believe that they must do everything within their power to ensure zero COVID infections, since that is the will of their president. But don't take my word for it. Here's a news report discussing China's zero COVID policy stance.
China is probably the only country in the world right now actively pursuing a zero COVID strategy. Simply put, the goal is to have no COVID cases at all in a country of 1.4 billion people.
China is taking no chances. This week, Anyang, population 5.5 million, became the country's third city to enter coronavirus lockdown. Authorities said cases there included 2 that were caused by the super-infectious Omicron variant. Anyang has joined the 1 million people of Yuzhou and the more than 13 million of Xi'an to be confined to their own 4 walls.
Now, what a lot of people might not understand is China's stay-at-home orders are not like ours. Here, you can go out, get groceries, go for walks, and protest to your heart's content. The stay-at-home orders in China are really stay-at-home, no matter what type of orders. So to me, it sounds like people can't even go to the grocery store, as shown with this continued report.
With so many under stay-at-home orders, providing food is a top priority. State TV has shown vegetables and other groceries being distributed. But residents have complained on social media over poor access to food and other essentials. But there have also been instances of widespread outrage. In Xi'an this month, a woman who was 8 months pregnant was denied medical care in a hospital like this because she hadn't had a COVID test. Turned away from the hospital, the woman miscarried on the street. The hospital manager was suspended, and top health officials publicly bowed in apology.
And if that's not terrifying enough, it looks like public shaming has returned back to the country.
And for those deemed to have broken lockdown rules, the punishment can be public too. State media said 4 suspects were put on display in the city of Jingxi on the border with Vietnam. They're accused of helping illegal immigrants cross the border into China. The public display of criminals was banned in 2010, but the practice has resurfaced during the coronavirus crackdown.
And what I found surprising as I was continuing to look into this is that there seems to be no minimum number of cases that will result in the lockdown of a whole city. For example, 13 million people were locked down in a city with just 200 cases. Government officials and neighborhood committees were delivering food to the residences, but watch and see how the citizens have been reacting. It's actually very disturbing. Here's the video on that.
But the effectiveness comes at a price, paralyzing entire cities like in Xi'an in the northwest. After around 200 cases were detected on December 23rd, 13 million inhabitants were locked down until further notice. Unless it was for testing, people were forbidden from going outside, even for shopping. Residents have been supplied by neighbourhood committees, but authorities acknowledge problems with supply lines. On social media, citizens have been complaining of hunger.
So it seems like the effectiveness of these measures are coming at a great price, not just with shutting down the local economies of the lockdown cities, but also with the citizenry. People in these cities are starting to show evidence of unrest, as you just saw in that last clip. And this is my fear. Impacts to the economy, which of course include potential impacts to Alibaba, are starting to weigh and could be a drag on results, as mentioned many times on this channel. And I know you guys hate me for saying this, but there are a ton of pro Alibaba echo chambers on YouTube, and I'm doing my best to be as neutral as possible, despite believing in my investment in Alibaba. And internal critics are even starting to speak out against the zero COVID policies, citing that the economy is being impacted as it's going to impair economic growth for the country. Here's a news report snippet of just that.
But critics of the zero COVID policy are rare, even if it is likely to affect China's economic growth this year. One exception was this eminent virologist interviewed on Hong Kong TV.
We shouldn't systematically carry out mass testing. If the government persists with the zero COVID policy for a handful of cases, I think the economy will suffer.
Now, a lot of people are going to say, especially in the comments below, that these measures are really just for the Winter Olympics, which start in a few weeks. But I actually disagree. I really think these zero COVID measures will continue past the Olympics. I found a good interviewer discussing the motivation behind the zero COVID policies in the next clip.
I'd like to talk a bit about the motivation behind this zero COVID policy. Is it primarily to do with keeping the Winter Olympics safe?
I would disagree. I mean, there's a strict Olympic bubble. The games will basically take place sealed off from the rest of the population. However, of course, the zero COVID policy has to do also with the prestige of it. I mean, China was one of the first countries that basically defeated the virus for most of the time, and the state media used that as an example to show how quote-unquote superior their system is. However, if you say that the biggest event for the zero COVID policy is actually at the end of the year, there will be the 20th Party Congress, and experts argue that China does not want to have any instability also caused by local COVID infections to disrupt the social stability for the 20th Party Congress, because during that time, Xi Jinping, the state leader, will declare his third term in office, and that's a very sensitive issue.
And so, of course, the inference is that if they're looking to keep zero COVID policies throughout 2022, we're just going to see more and more disruptions, as explained by Ben Cowling, epidemiologist at the Hong Kong University, in the next clip.
Well, I think if we look at the past 12 months, with outbreaks generally being in 1 or 2 cities at a time, I think what we're going to see in the coming year is more widespread outbreaks that take longer to control, but still only affect at any one time a minority of the population in China. So in that sense, I think they can still sustain it, but it's maybe not as good as it was in 2021. There's maybe more disruption than they would like.
Now, I do agree with Ben that there will be more widespread disruptions, especially with Omicron, as it is more infectious, but I'm not so sure that China will be able to contain it as much as Ben believes, as we have seen that it's more transmissible than the other variants, albeit it's less deadly. And with more and more unrest and non-compliance from an exhausted population, it may be harder and harder to control the longer this goes on, especially since it's already been over 2 years. But this news would make you believe that the whole country is locked down, which of course is not the case. Right now, only a small proportion of China is under lockdown, and most of the country is steady as she goes. Here's a great interview of regular life under zero COVID policies in China.
And journalist Fabian Kretschmer joins me now from Beijing with more. Fabian, what is daily life like living in a country with a zero COVID policy?
Yeah, I would say that daily life goes on pretty much undisturbed in most parts of the country. For example, I just came back from Wuhan, the city where the pandemic broke out 2 years ago, and yeah, the concert halls, they were crowded, also the shopping malls, the bars, etc. However, there's a constant fear lingering around that the authorities might impose a sudden lockdown. I mean, all what it takes is really a handful of COVID cases until the authorities really step in. And also there's a mental burden. I mean, you cannot easily travel around the country. You always need to have a negative COVID test ready. And of course, the borders, international borders, are shut. It's really quite difficult to travel out and back to China. So I would say it's a heavy burden. But for most people, especially in the provinces, life goes on just as normal.
My biggest question here is that since there seems to be no end in sight to these policies, and the economy is being impacted, how much can the country take? Which is exactly the next question asked by this journalist here.
But then how long can China afford these disruptions? Because the strategy to control these outbreaks involved lockdowns of millions of Chinese citizens, and not to mention the damage to the economy. How much of it can China take?
Well, I think you're right. The first line of defense is keeping the virus out of the community. And the longer that you can do that, the more time you have without any cases is the best. But then when there are outbreaks, you can see there's very disruptive interventions, which are very costly. And as these occur more frequently and take longer to control, I would say the case for zero COVID is less concrete than maybe it was in the past. And at the same time, the vaccine coverage in the mainland is going up and up and up. They're doing third doses now. So I think there would be a time when they could choose to switch over to another strategy away from zero COVID. But so far, they've shown no sign of planning that exit.
And as you guys may recall, China's not the only country within the region that has had zero COVID policies. They're just the only country that hasn't exited them. So the question is, what is China doing to emerge out of their zero COVID policies? Because at the moment, it doesn't look like they have a plan. And personally, I think they should be creating an exit plan to emerge from this. And the interviewee in the next clip makes such a point with the following.
I'd like to talk about some of the other countries which were following until recently a similar approach to China's, essentially the zero COVID approach. Countries like Australia, New Zealand, Singapore, Taiwan to some extent was also doing that. But then they've all switched strategy. They seem to have realized with variants such as Omicron and potentially future more transmissible variants that might hit these nations, it might be a better idea to just manage it and accept that COVID-19 is now endemic. Do you think that that is not the thinking in China?
I think you're right. I think a year or more ago, Singapore, Australia, New Zealand all had very clear exit strategies from the pandemic. They said they're going to hold on to zero cases until they can get vaccines to a high level, and then they're going to relax the zero COVID policies step by step and learn to live with the virus. In mainland China, there hasn't been the same kind of calculation. Zero COVID hasn't been a means to an end. It's an ongoing strategy which has a number of benefits, particularly minimizing the impact of COVID infections and severe cases. But at the same time, as you know, there are substantial costs to the policy. But for now, it seems like it's going to continue for a while.
What should the Chinese government be doing? Should they be thinking about an exit strategy, given that it sounds increasingly that this is not a sustainable strategy, the COVID zero strategy?
Yeah, I would say plan for an exit, because it's much better to have an exit that you plan rather than an exit that you didn't plan and can't control. Focus on getting third dose coverage to a very high level in the highest risk groups, the elderly and the highly exposed populations, and then have a plan to step by step progressively relax the zero COVID policies, maybe in some parts of the country first and then expanding to elsewhere. Keep a careful eye on the situation with COVID, but I think a planned exit would be the best strategy now and would have a lot of advantages over the current zero COVID strategy, which I worry will have more and more costs and fewer obvious benefits as time goes on.
I completely agree with what he just said. A continued zero COVID policy with a more infectious variant will just levy more and more costs to the economy with limited benefits. As an investor in Alibaba, these policies are a concern to me, as a further slowing economy would likely result in continuing underperformance by Alibaba. And as you guys can recall from the Investor Day, Alibaba really needs to be succeeding in China right now, as our international and other businesses are continuing to emerge, and most are, of course, unprofitable at the moment. So you can't have China as well being unprofitable due to zero COVID policies. I'm not saying that that could happen, but what I'm saying is that these lockdown measures could get worse as more and more cities go under lockdown because the Omicron variant is more infectious. I'm still a buyer of Alibaba, as these items are still shorter term in nature for an investor like myself that has a 10 to 20 year time horizon with this particular security. But I need to highlight this, as this is a relevant issue that I'm going to be watching very closely. Now guys, if you haven't done so already, please consider subscribing to the channel. I do my absolute best to bring you non-hype research focused content, and with your subscription, YouTube extends the reach of this channel, which allows us to help more and more people. Now, one of the growing voices that are saying that China is uninvestable is Jim Cramer. But does his argument make sense? I broke down his rationale in this video right here, and you absolutely don't want to miss this one.